This program is a video presentation via Zoom of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Founded in 1951, the Roundtable hosts monthly presentations at a location near Washington, D.C., more recently at the Fort Myer Officers Club. For more information, go to www.CWRTDC.org.
Jon Schmiel is a student of the Civil War. In his book, Citizen General Jacob Dobson Cox and the Civil War Era was deemed the best biography of the year in 2014 by Civil War Books and Authors. I believe we actually had Jon at the old Capitol Hill Civil War Roundtable talking about that topic. He's written 7 books in the last year and is working on a biography of General Irvin McDowell, which he told you earlier. Jon has presented at many roundtables around the country, from Ohio to New Jersey to North Carolina. An audio recording of his last presentation at the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia on June 14th was 2016 is posted. Okay. And he holds a PhD from, The Ohio State University, go Bucks, and was an assistant professor of history at St. Francis University before becoming a Foreign Service officer in the Department of State. And he's relatively local. He lives in Gainesville, which is near the Virginia, near the Manassas battlefield. So without any further ado, let's turn it over to Jon.
Well, thank you very much. Again, it's great to be back with you virtually. Next time, hopefully in person. So this is my, today I'm going to be talking about Civil War Trailblazers, Troublemakers, and many more. Civil War Trailblazers and Troublemakers was the title of the first book I wrote during the pandemic, which is over here in the top corner. And I had a lot more time. And so I thought, well, having written 1, why don't I write 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and then 6, and 7, and actually number 8 just came out a couple weeks ago over here, Civil War Virginians. So, and I'm working on Civil War Women, Volume 2. So these are not original research. They are short biographies of 50 people in these categories to give you an introduction to them. I have at least 2 books about each person for further reading. So it's a good way to get a feel for people in certain categories. And as I say here, after you read each one, I want you to be able to say, I didn't know that. So let's look at the first one. Let's look at Abraham Lincoln. Now, as you know, having written about Jacob Cox, I'm very prone to like political generals. And my version is that the best political general of the Union was Abraham Lincoln. Here's a guy who had, like most political generals, had no background in the military, but he came to have a much greater grasp of strategy and tactics. He understood better than anybody else that the objective was the enemy army, not its capital. I remember when after the Battle of South Mountain, just before Antietam, Lincoln congratulated McClellan and said, now go and destroy the enemy army. McClellan did not reply. You recall when Meade, after Gettysburg, said he had chased Lee out of Northern Territory, out of our territory, and Lincoln wrote to him saying, it's all our territory. Anyway, so Lincoln became by far the best political military general of the Union. And this painting here, in the last days of the war, with Sherman, Grant, and Admiral Porter, symbolize how he's the center of decision making. He came to Washington being underestimated by everybody, and he became one of the great presidents. So now let's look at another political general, Ben Butler. Now, most people think he's absolutely the worst political general, and he might have been. but he made some significant contributions. He stopped the efforts to make Maryland secede. He put down rebellion in Maryland. He's the one that created the idea of contrabands of war, which was the basis for essentially not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act and being able to hold on to the slaves who escaped. He was the commander in New Orleans for several months, and he cleaned up the disease. But today, even to today, he is the most hated man in New Orleans. And here's why. You may recall that the ladies of New Orleans were spitting at Union troops. And so Ben Butler issued a proclamation and said anybody that didn't treat the troops well would be considered a prostitute. And the reaction in New Orleans was the creation of the Ben Butler chamber pot, which even today is a hot selling item in New Orleans. A couple of years ago, I was in Vicksburg and I came across this toilet chair in one of the mansions in Vicksburg, and there's old Ben Butler at the bottom. So this is what the people in the South think of Ben Butler. Here's another fellow they don't like much in the South. They don't like much in the North either, but Judson Kilpatrick. His nickname was Kill Cavalry. He was an interesting fellow. He was arrested twice during the war. He had a reputation for womanizing. As the ladies can see, he's quite a handsome fellow. Actually, he isn't, but whatever. And he was very reckless in battle. But at one point, Sherman was asked, why in the hell do you want Kilpatrick on the march to the sea? And he said, I know Kilpatrick is a hell of a damn fool, but I want just that sort of man to command my cavalry on this expedition. And Kilpatrick was a damn fool, but he was a hell of a cavalry guy. And he was most famous for his raid into Richmond. And this was an article in Blue and Gray magazine about the Kilpatrick-Dahlgren raid, in which Dahlgren was killed and was discovered to have documents essentially saying that he was there to assassinate Jeff Davis. This was an impetus to the Confederates moving towards ultimately assassinating Abraham Lincoln. So Kilpatrick had a role in that too. Here's a trailblazer, Thadeus Loeb. Thadeus Loeb gave the Union one of the great capabilities of observation balloons. He gave a demonstration to Lincoln on the back lawn of the White House. He went up 500 feet in the air and had a telegraph line with him and sent a message to Lincoln. And it was a great success. And at the Battle of Fredericksburg was the last time it was used. The military establishment said, this is too newfangled. And more than once, I've read in the official records that the Confederates were scratching their heads saying the Union had this great asset and they gave it up. So Thadeus Loeb was very much an unsung hero. And this is one of the books about him called the One-Man Air Corps. And he was, because nobody supported him. They didn't go along with what he wanted. Here's another trailblazer, Patrick Cleburne, the Stonewall of the West. Very distinguished officer, but he was not promoted to senior ranks, partly because of his foreign birth, but also because he had very, very radical views about race. In a meeting with other generals in 1864, he said, we're in deep trouble. The North is arming black soldiers. They're going to have hundreds of thousands of black soldiers. We don't have any. We should do exactly the same thing. And if black soldiers join the Confederate Army, they should be promised their freedom after the war. He sent the proposal to Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis suppressed it, and it was found only 15 years later after the war. And it was only then that people learned about it. And Cleburne died at the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, and he said, "If we are to die, let us die like men." And here's a painting of Cleburne leading his men from the front, which at the Battle of Franklin, especially since the Federal troops had repeater rifles at that point, was not a really good idea. Here's Stan Watty. Now here's someone who's a trailblazer. He was the only Confederate Cherokee Indian general. Stan Watty was a landowner. He was a slave owner in Oklahoma. And he joined the Confederacy because he thought that if the Republicans gained power, they would outlaw slavery in Oklahoma and get rid of all his assets. So he mainly fought in the West and against other Indians. And it's interesting that he was the very last Confederate commander to surrender. And this was in late June. So he didn't get the news about the defeat until then. And he was a very highly respected Cherokee chief. And after the war, he negotiated several treaties for the Cherokees. And he did so well that he's the subject of a United States stamp issued in 1995, 32-cent stamp. Most people don't know about it, but obviously the Postal Service did. Then you have Harriet Tubman, the legend. Her achievements are very well known. She rescued people. She acted as a spy. And she even directed a Union attack on a Confederate outpost in South Carolina. I was just down in Beaufort, South Carolina, and they're about to build a statue of Harriet Tubman in downtown Beaufort. And as we know, she will soon be on a $20 bill. And these are the two National Park Service facilities which are dedicated to Harriet Tubman. The Harriet Tubman National Historical Park and the Underground Railroad Visitor Center. I also mentioned that the movie Harriet, which came out a couple of years ago, was, unlike all too many Civil War movies, really quite good and really quite accurate. So it's really worth seeing if you haven't seen it. Here's another fellow. Here's a trailblazer most people don't know about. That's George Sharp. George Sharp was a colonel under Hooker, and he was asked if he would like to try to create an Army intelligence capability, and he did. He was a lawyer. He created a systematic network of spies and methods of collecting and analyzing intelligence for the Army of the Potomac. And this I found very interesting. The CIA, in its history, wrote, quote, "His structured approach was not reinstitutionalized until 1947 when the CIA was created." So George Sharp was, to say the least, ahead of his time. And here's a book written by Peter Tsuras, who lives in this area, if anyone wants to read the biography of George Sharp. Then we have Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace was a trailblazer, but he was also a troublemaker. He was a political general. He was very temperamental. He often very criticized his superiors. Unfortunately, he didn't do it quietly. He often did it loudly, and that got him into great trouble with his superiors. And at the Battle of Shiloh, he was accused of causing one of the reasons why the Union did so poorly the first day. And Grant and Sherman had it in for Lew Wallace ever thereafter. He did well at the Battle of Monocacy. He helped to stave off Jubal Early's attack on Washington. And he was honored by Indiana with a statue in Statuary Hall, not because of his Civil War work, but because he's the author of Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, one of the most famous, and a book which continues today to be a bestseller. So this is his statue in Statuary Hall, and this is the placard about the book by the movie Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston and Jack Hawkins. Montgomery Meigs. Montgomery Meigs is the greatest unsung hero of the North for the Civil War. I tell people the one person you can compare him to is George Marshall. George Marshall was one of the great generals of World War II who never saw a battlefield. He stayed in Washington. Montgomery Meigs did the same. He was the man behind the scenes. No one had a better skill of logistics, command of supply, to assure the Union had everything it needed to win. And he was the one who, looking out one day from the White House, when they were discussing about all these the dead from the Civil War, he said, "I think I see a great place for a cemetery, Robert E. Lee's house, Arlington Cemetery." So he's the one that decided that. And after the war, he also designed what used to be called the Pension Building. It's now the National Building Museum. Those of you who have visited the Pension Building know that it has a bas-relief all the way around of Civil War soldiers up here. And this is the inside of the building. The pension clerks' offices were up above here. The rest of it was more for a display area. This building is used for inaugural balls after presidential inaugurations. It's a magnificent building. If you haven't been there, I obviously highly recommend it. Then we have Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is one of the great troublemakers. I think that's the very worst decision Lincoln ever made, was to choose him to be his vice president. His Reconstruction policy was a key to Southern resistance. One of the reasons why we have the problems we do today, I lay very much at the feet of Andrew Johnson. And I was just down in Beaufort, South Carolina. I was lecturing on a cruise, the American Cruise Lines. They have Civil War cruises from Jacksonville to Charleston. And I was on there in April for 2 weeks and talked about the rehearsal for Reconstruction in that part of the world, where thousands of blacks had been given their 40 acres. They'd been given responsibility. They were running their own cities, and Andrew Johnson reversed all those decisions and gave the white owners all the property rights that the South Sea Island blacks had had. So Andrew Johnson never made a positive decision, in my view. So this is a little placard about him being impeached. And frankly, I think Johnson should have been convicted and removed from office. He wasn't, but boy, he should have been. Matter of opinion. All right, more positive. Jonathan Letterman. Here's a trailblazer. People ask me about the medicine during the Civil War. I said when the Civil War started, the state of medicine was god-awful. And when it ended, it was awful, which is better than god-awful. And the improvements, because of people like Letterman, because of the thousands of women who became nurses, treatment was significantly improved during the war. And Letterman is the father. He instituted triage of cases. He instituted an efficient ambulance system. He created modern field hospitals, and he helped with the Sanitary Commission for an efficient control and supply of supplies. And modern management got their start under Letterman. But again, it was still chaotic. Here's a picture of one of the hospitals of people being carried here. It was chaotic. It was dirty. It was filthy. It was awful. But it was better than it was before. Here's an interesting character I learned a bit about. Captain Sally Tompkins. She was a maiden living in Richmond, and late in July 1861, the wounded from the first battle of Bull Run were being sent down to Richmond, to hospitals. And the Robertson House in Richmond was transformed into a hospital. And Sally Tompkins became the administrator. But Jefferson Davis said all our hospitals have to be military hospitals, and they can only be administered by military people. So Sally Tompkins became a captain. She was the only woman to have a title, a military title in the Confederate Army. And she was called the Angel of the Confederacy. And her hospital had the lowest mortality rate of any in the Confederacy. And afterwards, she was very active in reunion groups, always feted and heavily honored. And so she was given honors, one real and one possible honor. This was an interesting one. There's a church in there where this is Sally being honored for her work in the Confederate hospitals. This on the right here is something some of you may never have seen. In 1865, there was some discussion about maybe putting up a statue of Sally on Monument Avenue in Richmond. And one of the people who was asked to create a model for a possible statue was Salvador Dali, believe it or not. This is the model that Salvador Dali suggested. Here's Sally slaying a dragon, and here's Salvador Dali's finger, upon which the figure would be situated. Needless to say, this was not accepted. And so you have never seen this statue anywhere, especially not on Monument Avenue. But I thought it was interesting where Sally met Dali. Here's another very important character behind the scene, Thomas Nast. Lincoln said Thomas Nast was his best recruiter. He's probably the first and most important political cartoonist. Harper's Weekly was a very key source of news and support for the Union during the war. And Thomas Nast was a German immigrant. Very, very influential. He also invented Santa Claus, or at least the image of Santa Claus. And these are two of his most famous drawings. One on the left, a Christmas drawing. Here's the wife praying for her husband at the battlefront with the children in the bed. And here's the husband on the battlefront reading a letter from home, thinking about home. The sentimentality of the family of the Civil War. And this one here's Santa Claus meeting with some of the soldiers during the war. Then we have Katie Browning. Now, as you know, there are allegedly about 400 women who fought in the war, most of whom disguised as men. Katie Browning fought in the war as a woman, not disguised as a man. She and her husband joined a Rhode Island regiment under Ambrose Burnside, and she was officially recognized as the color bearer for the regiment. And she designed, like everybody else, she designed her own uniform. At First Manassas, she led the troops forward. And she received ultimately a military pension and a membership in the Grand Army of the Republic. So she's a unique individual. And here's a map of First Manassas, where Burnside was during the early attacks with the red arrow. And that's where Katie Browning was. And unlike many of the other troops, she did not run at the end. She retreated, but she did not run away. And as you know, color bearers are in the front. So she was in the front of the troops, not at the back. Then we have Gabriel Reigns. Look at that picture. Look at that sardonic grin on this fellow. Gabriel Reigns, when he was a kid, liked to fool around with bombs. He liked to throw bombs into rivers and blow up frogs. And he developed landmines, torpedo mines, and many others. And there were 2,000 mines detonated during the war, Confederate mines, and Gabriel Reigns was one of the key. James McPherson in his book, about the Civil War said that Reigns was one of the unsung heroes of the Confederacy. And one of his last acts was, in reaction to the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid, he developed a bomb which was going to be placed in the White House. It wasn't used, but part of that plot was the assassination attempts. So Reigns was someone who, he was very effective behind the scenes. And this is a little placard I found. Sherman got tired of having his men marching through landmine fields. So he decided the best way to do it was to have the Confederate prisoners march through the fields to find out where the mines were. So they were in charge of removing the mines or being blown up by them. Then we have one of my favorite people, Jacob Cox. He was one of the great defenders of political generals. He did so well during the war that at the end of the war, Sherman offered him a generalship in the regular army. And in his military reminiscences, he said, the best system for an army is an open system, one in which anybody can rise to the top. And as you know, something like what we have today. You recall Colin Powell became the military commander. He did not go to West Point. Neither did George Marshall. George Marshall went to VMI. Colin Powell rose up through the ROTC system. And that's my book, Citizen General, about Jacob Cox, if those of you want to read about that. Then we have William Quantrill, one of the great troublemakers of the Civil War. Those of you who have been to Vicksburg will know that the state monument to Missouri has one side for the Confederacy, one side for the Union. And that's a symbol of Missouri and Kansas being divided, internecine warfare. And after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, Quantrill formed his own force, Quantrill's Raiders of bushwhackers. And they were vicious nihilists. They essentially were vigilantes, killing anybody and everybody. And he's best known for his massacre in Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas was an abolitionist stronghold, and Quantrill sent his men in there and just said, burn everything down, kill all the men, and do whatever you want with the women and children. So this is a picture of the raid in Lawrence, Kansas. And today there's a Quantrill Society in Kansas, which meets every year to honor Quantrill. I don't know what you can honor him for, but there you are. Joshua Chamberlain. Now, Joshua Chamberlain, in my view, is one of the great overrated people of the Civil War. He did not join the war until mid-1862. His action at Gettysburg was useful, but by no means crucial to success. He wrote in his memoirs that he's the one that received the surrender of soldiers' arms and Appomattox. He did not. He was a superb self-promoter, though. And his post-war writings and Ken Burns and the book Killer Angels have made him famous. But Joshua Chamberlain was a mediocrity. Now, I know not many people will agree with that, but it's true. So, again, read The Killer Angels. It's a wonderful book. It's got a lot of facts in it, many of them true, many of them not. But Joshua Chamberlain is one of the great heroes of the Killer Angels. He is not one of the great heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg. Here's a great hero, Elizabeth Blackwell. She was the very first woman in the United States to get a medical degree in the 1850s. She's the one that created the basis for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which played a critical role in helping the medical care for the Union soldiers. She's the one that she came to Washington and said, please put me in charge of nursing for the Union, but she was elbowed out by Dorothea Dix. But after the war, she created medical schools just for women. because the women were not allowed into other medical schools. And she too got a U.S. postage stamp, 18 cents, the first woman physician in the United States. Then here's someone from behind the scenes, William Slade. William Slade was the chief usher at the White House for many years before Lincoln, for many years after Lincoln. Essentially, he ran the White House. And Lincoln would often ask him for his opinion about issues. And he asked him about his views about Black soldiers and abolition and colonization. And Slade was very, very influential, pushing Lincoln about abolition, about Black equality, about Black troops, and also convincing him to have the two meetings that he had with Frederick Douglass. So a very important man behind the scenes. And this is a painting of one of the meetings with Frederick Douglass, meeting with Lincoln, appealing for abolition, appealing for recruitment of Black troops. And Slade played a critical role in that. Also critical role was John Hay. John Hay was, this is Hay with Lincoln here. At 23 years old, he and John Nicolay ran the White House. Today we have probably thousands of people running the executive branch. These two young fellows in their 20s were running the White House. He lived there, he worked there 24/7, has special missions. So he was an incredible job running the war effort. And then, of course, later on, he became Secretary of State under McKinley and Roosevelt. And he and John Nicolay wrote their 10-volume biography of Lincoln is a key source for the memory of Lincoln. And this is a wonderful book written, I think, a couple of years ago, Lincoln's Boys, and how they were the ones who created Lincoln's image. So if you haven't read it, I really highly recommend reading this book. Finally, we have the greatest troublemaker of all, the absolute worst political general, worse than Ben Butler. This guy did nothing except screw things up. He was a corrupt politician. He killed a man and got away with it. He killed Francis Scott Key's son, who was fooling around with his wife, and got away with it. At Gettysburg, he disobeyed orders, nearly lost the battle. And of course, for doing all these terrible things, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. And today there is a Sickles Avenue at Gettysburg. I don't understand that. Now, I know he was on a commission that helped to create Gettysburg, and he had a lot of political influence, but the guy was corrupt from top to bottom and was, again, did nothing positive in the war. That's a matter of opinion, I know. Here's a picture of Sickles killing Francis Scott Key's son. And as most of you know, one of his lawyers who got him off was Edwin Stanton. And here's a picture of the arrow showing where Sickles, having been given orders to stay up here on Cemetery Ridge, decided to move forward and almost lost the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd. So those are again, there are many, many others. In the 8 books I've written, 50 each, some duplicated, there's probably 375 different people, individuals. But I also, in my first book, I thought it's also important to remember there were many other trailblazers that no one will remember, but they needed to be mentioned too. These are significant. Nurses and nursing nuns. There were 4,000 women who became nurses for the Union. 800 of them were nuns. When the Civil War started, there were 25 hospitals run by nuns in the United States. They were ready to be nurses, and they did a great job. So these are true trailblazers behind the scenes. American nursing was transformed during the Civil War. Another group of people were the telegraphers and the signal corpsmen. the fact that the generals could communicate with each other, communicate with Washington, and the Confederates could communicate with their headquarters was because of these fellows running that telegraph line miles after miles after miles, back and forth. And also the signal corpsmen, these guys who were up there sending signals, but also looking and seeing what was going on, observing what was going on the other side. Then we have the bands and the drummer boys. They were always there stirring the men to get going. The drummer boys playing a critical role here. This picture was taken at Lookout Mountain outside Chattanooga. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd want to be standing there. It looks like there's snow on the ground. Looks like rather a precarious perch. But there they were playing on Lookout Mountain. Drovers in Vivandière. The drovers are the ones who drove those herds of cattle behind the lines so that when the Union needed beef for their dinners, these are the guys who make sure they had them behind. And the Vivandières. These are the women who were nurses, who ran little shops, little sutlers' shops behind the lines. And this is a picture of Marie Tepe. Marie Tepe was a Vivandière with the Zouaves in the Army of the Potomac, and she earned the Kearny Cross. And you can see her, one thing she's got under her arm here, this is the whiskey. She was in charge of the whiskey supply, which was also a very important matter. And finally, another group which deserved to be mentioned were the chaplains, hundreds of chaplains, and cooks. They were also crucial to the success of both sides, trailblazers behind the scenes. So these are my books. These are the 8 books that I've written about people in the Civil War. They're available on Amazon.com. This is my website. Again, the latest is Civil War Virginians. And that's the end of my talk. So thank you very much. Is it time for me now to stop sharing?
Yeah.
Okay, I've stopped sharing.
Good.
We're back.
Before we open it up for questions, I just want to thank you. That was really, really great. I especially though wanted to thank you because of most people know my affiliation with Civil War Medicine and National Museum of Civil War Medicine, for mentioning Jonathan Letterman and also the nurses.
Right.
And because we always say that these topics don't get enough play. Everybody wants to know what about the battles and where the regiments and the divisions were, but not so much about what happened afterwards. So I appreciate it, and also mentioning Meigs and the pension building and the fact that he designed the steps in there so amputees could more easily negotiate the steps in the pension building, because he knew that a lot of amputees would be coming into the pension building. The people at Gettysburg will tell you that they think that maybe the military park wouldn't have happened without Sickles, but that's a for another day. It's a discussion. You go up to Gettysburg and you talk all day about that. Okay, yep. So and I guess Elon Farnsworth didn't think so much of Justin Kilpatrick either.
Right. You don't attack an infantry corps with one cavalry brigade.
Yeah.
He told Kilpatrick it was suicide, and Kilpatrick called him a coward, so he went ahead and did it. And
Kilpatrick said, "Don't you know my name is Kill Cavalry?"
Yeah.
But you're right about Chamberlain, though. David Ireland had a bayonet charge on Culp's Hill that nobody talked about.
Well, this is one of the things that most irritated me. I mean, Jacob Cox ran rings around Chamberlain, the things that he did in the Civil War. Nobody knows who the hell he is because he was so self-effacing. In his first 2 books that he wrote about the Civil War, he didn't even mention his own name.
Yeah. Well, with Chamberlain,
Chamberlain mentioned his own name.
But you can thank Ken Burns
Right.
and the movie, Ron
Yeah.
Maxwell's movie
and Jeff Daniels,
And Jeff Daniels. Well, that's Maxwell's movie. Yeah.
No, what bothered me about Chamberlain, well, you would think the 20th Maine was the only regiment on the left on Little Round Top.
Yeah.
And really the hero was the brigade commander, Strong Vincent, who got killed. And one of the things that bothered me about Chamberlain was, the 15th Alabama, which stormed up Little Round Top, was commanded by William C. Oates. His brother was killed and he lost a limb. He subsequently became governor of Alabama. He wanted to put a marker on Little Round Top about halfway up, which is how far the 15th Alabama got. And Chamberlain, who was on the Monument Commission, this was in the 1880s, said, no, you never got that far. And so the marker never went up. What a crappy thing to do. on behalf of Chamberlain. But I wanted to comment on one or two others. Judson Kilpatrick, he was also Anderson Cooper's great-grandfather.
There you go.
He married a Vanderbilt. So he's, through his maternal line, he's Anderson Cooper's great-great-grandfather. But I need to, Sickles, as one thing you had to say, I would say, I mean, you say he's the worst, but he had guts. He wasn't, yeah. I don't think anybody doubted his bravery. I mean, he lost a leg there in Gettysburg, and, he put a cigar in his mouth and told the troops to fight on as he was carried off the field. So he was a leader and he had guts. He didn't know what he was doing. Although Longstreet, it kind of supports tactically what he did, because he was on Cemetery Ridge. Wasn't really a ridge, the part he had, it was more of a depression. Right. And he'd gotten burned at Chancellorsville for giving up the high ground. So Hazel Grove. So he advanced to the Peach Orchard, which was higher ground. He got both his divisions wiped out, but he more or less slowed down Longstreet enough that Longstreet was unsuccessful in that overall attack. So you can argue that both ways.
There you go. There's Kilpatrick. Also, I want to mention that you mentioned Elizabeth Blackwell. There's a book I just read about her and her sister. The doctors Blackwell. Her sister was also a doctor. Right. Yeah, she was also incredible. Elizabeth Blackwell. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning her too.
She should have been the head of nursing, not Dorothy and Dix.
Oh yeah, I mean Dix was good with the mental health, but yeah.
She was more aggressive. So there you are.
And my friend Kurt Fields, who plays Grant, he's got one of those Butler chamber pots.
I keep asking my wife, I want one for Christmas, but she never gets it for me.
But I think one thing Butler did that was pointed out by one of our past speakers, I didn't realize, what was that famous, when Butler became a congressman after the war, what was the name of the famous Civil War photographer?
Matthew Brady.
Yeah, Matthew Brady. He rescued his collection. He got because Brady went bankrupt. Yeah. And Butler passed a bill to buy the Brady collection on behalf of the United States and put it into the archives. So that's one thing we can thank Butler for.
He also chaired the committee that investigated the Lincoln assassination too, Butler.
I'd like to offer one more revolutionary person during the war. As some of you know, I'm a retired railroader, and Herman Hulp. He absolutely revolutionized how the Union conducted the railroad war, the first railroad war, and to the point where one of the Confederate generals said that Sherman carried a tunnel with him. So he was revolutionary, and particularly when we lived in Virginia, you could see a lot of the areas where he worked in, and it was significant with what he designed and had ready to go, which, now we railroaders take panel track and prefab switches and assemble your kit bridges for granted, but he developed a lot of that during the war.
He is one of the key, in my book, unsung heroes. He is one of them.
The one comment I was going to make is that Dan Sickles, his acquittal with the Key murder was the first successful use of the temporary insanity defense in the United States.
Yes.
Bill Binzel is holding up a book on that.
McNaught.
Let me make a comment. Someone, Jim Anderson, mentions about that I said 400 women allegedly participated in combat. Well, we don't, again, 400 is the estimate that people say. We don't know. It might have been 300, it might have been 500. Most of them were obviously doing it surreptitiously. They didn't want to be found out. The documentation is cloudy. Unfortunately, several women made up a lot of what they did or didn't do anything. But 400 is a good estimate. And if I said allegedly, that was the wrong word. Probably 400 women participated in combat. Katie Brownell, not Katie Browning, Katie Brownell was one of those who was actually named as a member of the military and got a pension. So mea culpa on.
Most of those other women were just disguised as men.
Yeah.
Some of them got found out when they got wounded and had to take their uniform. Doctors took their uniform off.
Now, Gene, we have your email address that you provided at the end there. You might want to go ahead, just pop that up. I'm glad you mentioned the nurses and other folks. I know that Peggy, one of our members has written books on that too, and we've heard stories about how for each person out there fighting in the battle, there are 10 folks that are supporting it. I did not have any idea that they actually rounded up cattle and kept them moving with the troops. I thought it was a matter of logistics, getting the meat that was butchered elsewhere out to the troops. But that is interesting.
Let me mention nothing about nursing. I always mention to people that Clara Barton said, I am not a nurse. She seemed pretty adamant about it. She said, I supply things, and obviously her contributions are just enormous, but she always used to say, I'm not a nurse. What do you think, John?
Well, I used to be a docent at the missing soldiers office, and we definitely
contributions.
Yeah, we do not at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine call Clara Barton a nurse. George, we used to call her first responder.
Which she was.
But definitely you're right, not a nurse.
But on the other hand, her story about, her monument at Antietam, quite impressive. And her story is she was actually nursing someone and a bullet passed through her sleeve and killed the man that she was helping. So
some of the stuff that she claimed happened came out in her lecture series after the war, that it's not that she didn't make a lot of contributions, but like all of these people, they tend to embellish as time goes by.
Now, Bill, so Gene, what are you working on now for your, is it your 9th book now if you're going to do another one?
Yes, and this one's volume 2 of the Civil War women. I discovered, especially on the cruise boats where 65% of the passengers are women, that's the most popular book. Hard to believe, right? So that's the next one. 50 more women who made a difference.
Well, there's lots of unsung women, that's for sure.
Oh yeah. But also the biography of Irvin McDowell, which again has never been done before. And I also have done an annotated book about Jacob Cox's letters home. He wrote 203 letters during the Civil War, which track his progress from, again, the former divinity student to someone offered a generalship in the regular army, and his letters to his wife, who was also a college graduate. She was the daughter of the president of Oberlin College. He treated her as an equal. And so University of Tennessee Press is looking at that one. They have a series called Voices of the Civil War, many of which are letters collections. And so that's another project.
I'm going to have to change the email to indicate that if you're having trouble with the link, use this other link and put in the meeting ID and the password. But we had a good group. So Gene, thank you very much for your.
Thank you all.
We're 10